Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. In the studio with us is Dr. Ellen Littman, an old friend and literally the world's leading expert on ADHD and women. She's a clinical psychologist licensed in New York State. She has been in the field of attentional disorders for over 27 years. She co-authored Understanding Girls with ADHD, a book, and is a contributing author of other books like The Hidden Side of Adult ADHD, Understanding Women with ADHD, and Gender Differences in ADHD. Ellen, welcome back to the program. It's been a year or so since you've been on with us, and it's great to have you.
About 4.
4 years, really? Wow, time flies. Yeah. Incredible. Well, I'm so glad that you're back and with us. We are looking at the possibility that the Supreme Court is going to roll back the rights of women to have an abortion, that broadly speaking, the Supreme Court could, a so-called conservative court, could become hostile to women in a whole lot of other ways, from, you know, the right to vote to the right to work to, I mean, just, you know, this whole spectrum of stuff. And at the same time, women and girls are, particularly those with ADHD, are facing a whole panoply of challenges, many of which are unacknowledged. Where do we start with this conversation? Okay,
well, there's been a traditional look to ADHD that most clinicians and most of the lay public is familiar with, usually hyperactive boys. Mm-hmm. And it hasn't been well acknowledged that girls and women can have ADHD, and that presents very differently, and that we're finding that the outcomes are also very different and more negative for females.
So, for example, how ADHD in a boy, you know, is, I think everybody understands, you know, it's the kid who erupts in class, the kid who acts out, the kid who's the class clown, the kid who can't study, the kid who ultimately, you know, very often fails or drops out tragically. The high IQ kids sometimes can push through, but it's brutal and painful. That's almost a stereotype. It's so well known. How does ADHD present itself in girls typically?
Well, we're finding that the majority of girls are actually not hyperactive, or certainly not hyperactive in an observable way. So they look very different. So they're most likely to be overlooked. And what we're discovering was that right now, in a clinic, 9-to-1 boys to girls. In the population, maybe 2-to-1 boys to girls. But in a clinic with adults who can self-refer, it's 1-to-1. So what we know is that we are missing a lot of girls. And by the time we do recognize them, or women self-refer, they have already suffered with undiagnosed ADHD for a long time and have developed a lot of dysfunctional coping mechanisms to help them along the way. And it makes the disorder even more complex when it does come to light.
So what's going on in the mind and life experience of, say, a teenage girl with ADHD who's in school and, you know, facing the challenges of ADHD, and why is it not so visible to their teachers?
And the girls that I'm particularly focusing on are the ones who are primarily inattentive type. In other words, they are not disruptive, and they may be a little chatty in class, but in general, they're more the passive, compliant, back in the day called space cadets, who are not being disruptive, so they're not really coming to anyone's attention. They may be doing an average performance in class, and no one is assuming maybe they could do much better. They're not problematic, but they feel different. They dread being called on. They feel confused. They process information more slowly, and gradually they start to withdraw and do not end up feeling effectual in their lives.
So we're basically destroying their potential to be successful adults?
Well, certainly the longer it goes unrecognized, it does get more and more serious. And as what we're finding out now, and this is fairly new research, is that estrogen is very much involved in the way ADHD presents in girls. So it really separates their trajectory completely from what boys are experiencing. So once estrogen comes into their systems,
that's post-puberty?
Yeah, their symptoms start to blossom and become more observable, but they tend to look more emotional in terms of volatility, moodiness, more anxiety, and that is easily misdiagnosed as anxiety disorder or some sort of depressive disorder, and they may be medicated inappropriately. And so that is another major point where you want clinicians to be thinking, maybe there's underlying ADHD, because that is where they become more problematic. They have more trouble in school in their attempt to find a way to connect with others and be able to conform in some way. They're drawn to things that will arouse their brains, not necessarily in a healthy way, so they're going to be more interested in drugs and alcohol, smoking cigarettes, early sexual experiences, and things that may derail them from performing in school.
Are we as a society, is this, I guess the essence of my question is, what do we do about this? And obviously we're failing these girls, and there's massive lost potential, particularly from the high, and I'd like you to address the difference between high IQ kids with ADHD and average kids with ADHD, girls in this case. But obviously we're losing extraordinary potential here. How should we respond beyond just teaching doctors that you shouldn't give antidepressants to somebody with ADHD because they're not depressed? That's not, depression isn't the, quote, disease they have, it's the symptom of the underlying condition of ADHD. Right. But that's just one step. It seems like we need a much larger, more societal, structural change, like we're doing for boys with ADHD. We're actually changing our educational system in a lot of ways to accommodate boys with ADHD.
Well, it is part of a bigger picture. Because the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, that is the American Psychiatric Association's Bible for diagnosis, is based on the behavior of young white boys. And the longer that we try to compare girls, especially inattentive girls or girls in different cultures, ethnicities, they all will not measure up on those criteria and will be deemed, as someone once said, ADD wannabes. They will not meet those criteria, but we're understanding now that nor should they, because girls and women have a lot of developmentally different behaviors, whether or not they have ADHD. For example, girls and women have more anxiety and depression in general than men and boys. So it is not surprising that ADHD exacerbates those tendencies.
Do you think that's a function of a society that essentially has historically made girls and women the property of men, and more recently at least makes them largely subordinate to men, or treats them as less than men?
Right. Well, yes, I think that is the real underlying piece here. So that this is the experience of boys and men, that is been the precedent, and when you measure girls up against that yardstick, of course they will not meet those criteria, but nor should they. So the point is that we really need an entirely different set of criteria by which to measure ADHD girls and women against girls and women that don't have ADHD.
As opposed to against 7-year-old white boys.
Exactly. And while that may seem like a logical statement that I just made, it is only just becoming an issue that, researchers are considering. So maybe only in the last 5 years, primarily, have researchers started to consider, okay, instead of comparing girls and women to boys and men, we're going to compare them to control girls and women with completely different results.
Yeah, I've often wondered, about my own ADHD, and I'll cop to it. I'm proudly raise my hand and say I'm a member of that tribe. That it was not my dad. My dad was actually, he worked in a tool and die shop for most of his life, but he did the bookkeeping for them. He taught Louise double entry bookkeeping when we started our first business. My dad was one of these very careful, very methodical, very focused. He was a farmer, and a very good one. My mom, on the other hand, was, the house was a disaster. Mom was a disaster in some ways. I mean, she was a wonderful and loving mother, and I was so lucky to have her as a mother. But when I look back now, and particularly through the prism or the lens of this diagnostic criteria that you're laying out for us for girls with ADHD, between her ADHD and the fact that she had 4 boys within 7 years, and all 4 of us, I think, at least 3 of the 4 of us, clearly classify, are my mom, our ADHD. Right. And maybe all 4 of us, I don't know, I'd have to discuss that with one of my other brothers, but in fact, actually, the one that I'm thinking wasn't ADHD was the one that was put on Ritalin when he was at school, because he was the youngest of the bunch. And he's the one that I would say probably, I would have a hard time diagnosing, or whatever the appropriate word is. But I'm guessing there's a lot of that out there. A lot of women who just, well, we're hitting a break here, who are just like overwhelmed and don't realize that that this isn't how, they think this is how it is because this is essentially how they were born. Let's talk some more in just a moment about how to reach out to these people, what can we do for them, how can we change our schools. We've talked a little bit about medicine and therapy and things. We'll be right back with Dr. Ellen Littman. Stick around. And welcome back. Dr. Ellen Littman is with us. Her website is drellenlittman.com, is it? Yeah, drellenlittman.com. So to the issue that I just brought up.
It's a great point, because obviously when your mother was growing up, there was absolutely no thought of girls or women having ADHD. And the experience of women, especially women who are mothers, is a situation where they are overwhelmed all the time, and they feel frantic and different, and they have trouble doing what many call the job from hell, which is just to manage all of these different details and organize a whole bunch of people, especially people who may not be organized themselves, and they feel different than their peers. And women want to conform to the gender role expectations of our society. Whether or not they actively, intellectually agree with them or not, they still feel compelled to do so. And women with ADHD are always seeing themselves fall short and are filled with shame about it. And shame is the central experience. While they're struggling to do all these things, they tend to feel they're not entitled to ask for help. And they just struggle valiantly, but generally silently. And that's where the anxiety about trying to be hypervigilant and make sure they get all the things done that they need to get done for themselves and their families, and also demoralization when something falls through the cracks, as it just necessarily will.
Yeah.
And those are the things that start contributing to the negative outcomes that we are discovering.
Yeah, my mom would never invite neighbors over to the house because she was just embarrassed by what kind of housekeeper she was. And in fact, when Louise and I got married, this is 47 years ago, she would go over and help my mom clean the house and just do these like 2-day binges. But within a few weeks, it was just back to, kind of craziness. Mm. And so if you had my mom or somebody like her in your office and you were sitting talking with her as her therapist, what would you say?
Well, the thing that we can do as clinicians to be helpful, we can't change brain wiring, but we can do a lot in terms of reframing so that people can accept themselves and even celebrate their strengths and understand that everyone has strengths and weaknesses, and the fact that they may be disorganized homemakers, which, you know, for many women, it's absolutely humiliating, even though it's irrelevant in the broader scheme of how who one is as a person and how their families turn out. So getting women to accept, to question societal ideals. Well, what is the feminine ideal, and does it really make any sense? And what part of it do you really need to adhere to? And what actually is a better fit for you? And the idea that it is okay to ask for help, and that's not a sign of weakness. So there are a lot of things that women can learn to come to terms with.
Great stuff. Great stuff. We'll be back with Dr. Ellen Lippman in just a moment. Stick around. Welcome back to the Thom Hartmann Program. Dr. Ellen Lippman is with us in the studio. Her website is Dr. Ellen Lippman, Dr. Ellen Lippman, LITTMAN.com, and a clinical psychologist licensed by the state of New York, et cetera, and co-author of Understanding Girls with ADHD, and in fact, one of the world's leading experts on women and girls and ADHD, and it's such a pleasure and an honor to have you with us, Ellen. We were talking about you know, the woundings and the damage that goes along with this on the one hand, and I'd like you to address some of those negative outcomes, you know, that are the consequence of that. But also this, I mean, you know, this is now fairly well accepted to have a very, very large genetic component. And, you know, my ADHD mom produced a bunch of ADHD boys, and, you know, which was problematic for all of us in some ways, but, you know, I didn't mind growing up in a messy house. I thought this, in fact, I thought it was kind of cool. Mm. But, you know, how does that happen? And also, you know, why is that gene there? Is there some value to this?
Well, I think you certainly have made the best argument about the fact that you know, there is a lot of value evolutionarily to hunters, and you know, that made sense, especially for men. And then, you know, women are just trying to start to embrace, well, what would it mean to be a female hunter, to be a warrior, to feel like they can go out and do the things that their brains are best wired for, that to follow their passions and to be visionaries. And that's really where, you know, I think the work is in those who are really thinking progressively, is not to simply go with acceptance and, you know, not feeling shame about not having baked the cupcakes for your child's birthday yourself, but you bought them in the store. But really to say, okay, so what are you better wired for? And delegate and get help with the things that are rote, repetitive, and like that aren't going to move yourself, your family, or the world forward. So
my mom should have hired a housekeeper, for example, if she could have
if it's possible.
Yeah.
I mean, that's something that plagues women. And they feel like they're not allowed to move on until they have made all the beds and, you know, cooked a 3-course dinner every night, and rather to say, okay, those are the things that are not necessarily important to being, you know, a good human being, and what are the things that you are better wired for, and pursue those, and understand that there are strengths and weaknesses for everyone, and it is not weakness to not do those things, because men with ADHD do not seem to have that same concern. They have secretaries, they have wives, and then they can move forward with their interests, and women also could use wives, essentially. But the idea that women are entitled to pursue the things that they want to do based on the way their brains are wired. Unfortunately, what most women with ADHD do at this point in time is continue to feel ashamed and worse about themselves. They keep this a secret. They don't tell their friends. Often they don't even tell their spouses. And they suffer silently.
Right.
They would never tell a doctor about it. They minimize and
So they need to reach out and get help.
Yeah.
Dr. Ellen Lippman. Ellen, thanks so much for being with us today. It's great talking with you.
it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
If you want more information about this, Dr. Ellen Lippman's website is drellenlittman.com, drellenlittman.com.